Join us on Patreon and become part of our journey to uncover history's untold stories. Your support helps us create in-depth content, bring hidden narratives to life, and keep history alive for everyone.
The story of medicine, as most people know it, is told through the lens of laboratories, universities, and clinical trials. The image that often comes to mind is that of men in white coats, working under sterile lights, measuring compounds, and carefully recording outcomes in journals. Yet, long before the rise of modern biomedicine, the knowledge of healing was safeguarded by communities that understood plants, the human body, and the balance of nature with extraordinary precision. For thousands of years, indigenous peoples across the world developed healing practices rooted not in the written word or controlled experiments, but in memory, oral tradition, ceremony, and an intimate relationship with the natural environment. Their medicine was not merely about curing illness, but about preserving harmony between the individual and the community, between the body and the spirit, between humans and the land itself. Today, as pharmaceutical industries rake in trillions of dollars and health systems grapple with chronic diseases that modern medicine struggles to control, there is a growing recognition that ancient indigenous healing traditions contain knowledge that could transform the future of medicine. This recognition is not born out of nostalgia, nor out of a romanticized view of the noble savage, but from hard scientific evidence showing that many of the world's most important medicines, from aspirin to quinine, have roots in indigenous knowledge. What is striking, however, is how much more remains untapped, often ignored, and in some cases deliberately suppressed to protect the monopolies of modern pharmaceutical companies. To understand how this knowledge could reshape medicine, we must first explore how it developed, how it was treated under colonialism, and how it continues to survive against all odds. When Europeans first arrived in the Americas, Africa, and Asia, they were often astonished by the deep botanical wisdom of the communities they encountered. Among the Nawa and Maya of Central America, healers identified hundreds of medicinal plants with specific applications, many of which were carefully recorded by early colonial scribes. The famed 16th century Florentine Codex, compiled under the supervision of Spanish friar Bernardino de Sahagún, contains detailed descriptions of plants used by Aztec healers for conditions ranging from fevers to digestive problems. These remedies were not haphazard guesses, but were the result of centuries of experimentation, observation, and intergenerational refinement. In the Andes, the Quechua and Aymara peoples used coca leaves not only as a stimulant, but also as a remedy for altitude sickness, a practice that modern pharmacology later refined into anesthetics derived from cocaine. Across the Atlantic, African healing traditions carried equally profound knowledge. Long before modern parasitology, healers in West and Central Africa treated fevers and malaria-like illnesses with decoctions of bark and roots that contained alkaloids now known to have anti-malarial properties. The knowledge of the cinchona tree in South America, whose bark produces quinine, also arose from indigenous use long before European scientists isolated its chemical compound. In both cases, traditional healers did not simply stumble upon treatments by chance. Their knowledge systems were based on an intricate understanding of plant properties, often guided by ritual, spirituality, and collective memory. In North America, indigenous nations such as the Cherokee, Navajo, and Lakota cultivated extensive pharmacopoeias. The Cherokee, for example, used willow bark as a pain reliever centuries before modern chemists derived salicylic acid, the basis of aspirin. They also treated inflammation with golden seal root and utilized echinacea to stimulate immune responses. Echinacea today is one of the most widely used herbal remedies in the world, valued for its antiviral and antibacterial effects. The use of sweat lodges by Plains tribes, which combine heat therapy with ceremonial purification, can also be seen as an early form of detoxification and immune stimulation, a practice that modern medicine now recognizes as beneficial through the science of hyperthermia. The significance of these healing traditions goes beyond the plants themselves. Indigenous medicine has always been holistic, blending the physical, spiritual, and social dimensions of health. Illness was rarely seen as an isolated mechanical fault in the body. Rather, it was understood as an imbalance between the individual and their environment, their ancestors, or their community. Healing therefore required not only physical remedies, but also ceremonies, storytelling, and communal care. For example, among the Dagara people of Burkina Faso, healing rituals involve music, dance, and community participation, recognizing the interconnectedness of health and social harmony. Similarly, in many Native American traditions, the role of the medicine person was not limited to curing symptoms but to restoring harmony in the patient's life, ensuring balance between body, mind, and spirit. Colonialism, however, drastically altered the trajectory of indigenous medicine. European colonizers frequently dismissed traditional healing as superstition or witchcraft, and in many regions, they actively suppressed it. Missionaries often burned herbal manuscripts and discouraged the use of traditional healers, replacing them with Christianized forms of care. In Africa, colonial governments criminalized indigenous spiritual healers, labeling them as sorcerers or threats to public order. This suppression was not merely ideological, it was also economic. By delegitimizing indigenous knowledge, colonial powers could impose Western medicine as the only legitimate form of healing, thereby justifying the importation of European doctors, pharmaceuticals, and health systems that enriched colonial economies. Yet even as indigenous medicine was marginalized, European science quietly drew from it. Many botanical gardens established in colonial centers were filled with specimens identified and classified by indigenous experts, even if their names were erased from the historical record. The cinchona tree, the kava plant, African kola nuts, and countless others entered global trade networks because of indigenous knowledge. This pattern of appropriation without acknowledgement continues today in what scholars call biopiracy, the exploitation of traditional knowledge and genetic resources by corporations without proper compensation or recognition to the communities that preserve them. Despite centuries of suppression, indigenous healing knowledge never disappeared. Communities continued to pass down oral traditions, sometimes in secret, sometimes in hybrid forms alongside Western medicine. In recent decades, there has been a revival of interest in these practices, both from indigenous peoples themselves reclaiming their heritage and from scientists seeking new cures. The World Health Organization estimates that around 80% of the global population still relies on traditional medicine for some aspect of primary health care. In countries like India and China, traditional systems such as Ayurveda and traditional Chinese medicine have become integrated into national healthcare systems. In Africa and the Americas, herbal medicine and spiritual healing remain deeply rooted in community life, often serving as the first line of defense in rural areas where modern hospitals are scarce. Scientific research increasingly validates what indigenous healers have long known. The rosy periwinkle of Madagascar, used locally in traditional medicine, led to the development of vincristine and vinblastine, two of the most powerful anti-cancer drugs in modern oncology. The knowledge of the neem tree in India, used for its antibacterial and antifungal properties, has inspired a wave of pharmaceutical and agricultural applications. Similarly, the psychoactive plants used in Amazonian shamanic rituals, such as ayahuasca, are now being studied for their potential to treat depression, PTSD, and addiction. What Western science once dismissed as primitive is now the frontier of mental health research. The challenge, however, lies in how this knowledge is integrated into modern medicine. Too often, pharmaceutical companies extract active compounds from traditional remedies, patent them, and commercialize them, while the indigenous communities that preserve the knowledge receive little or no benefit. This not only perpetuates historical injustices, but also undermines the holistic philosophy that makes indigenous medicine unique. For indigenous healers, plants are not merely chemical factories but sacred beings, part of a web of life that requires respect and reciprocity. Stripping away that worldview to extract profit risks losing the deeper wisdom that could transform not just our treatments, but our understanding of health itself. As climate change threatens biodiversity and ecosystems worldwide, the urgency of preserving indigenous healing knowledge becomes even more apparent. Many of the plants used in traditional medicine grow in ecologically sensitive regions, rainforests, savannas, mountain highlands, that are rapidly disappearing under the pressures of deforestation, mining, and industrial agriculture. Protecting indigenous lands, therefore, is not only a matter of cultural survival, but of global health security. The next great cure for cancer, Alzheimer's, or antibiotic resistance may lie in a plant known only to a community in the Amazon, the Congo, or the Pacific Islands. In recent years, some efforts have emerged to create more equitable frameworks for sharing and protecting indigenous knowledge. The Nagoya Protocol on Access and Benefit Sharing, adopted under the Convention on Biological Diversity, aims to ensure that communities receive fair compensation when their traditional knowledge leads to commercial products. Some universities and research institutes now work in partnership with indigenous healers, recognizing them as co-creators of knowledge rather than passive informants. Indigenous scientists themselves are also bridging worlds, combining formal biomedical training with ancestral wisdom to create new models of healthcare that honor both traditions. The story of indigenous healing knowledge is not one of the past but of the future. At a time when modern medicine faces enormous challenges, rising antibiotic resistance, chronic lifestyle diseases, mental health crises, and inequities in access to care, the holistic, sustainable, and community-centered approaches of indigenous medicine offer vital lessons. It is not a question of replacing modern science with ancient rituals, but of weaving the two together in ways that honor both rigor and respect. The greatest danger is not that indigenous medicine is unscientific, but that modern society continues to ignore it until it is too late. The ancestors who first chewed bitter bark for fever, who prayed over roots before grinding them into powders, who sat with the sick and sang them back into balance, were scientists in their own right. Their laboratories were forests, mountains, and rivers. Their records were not written on paper, but inscribed in memory, ritual, and song. Today, as humanity searches for cures to the most pressing diseases of our time, their wisdom may yet prove to be the key to healing not only our bodies but our broken relationship with the natural world.